Welcome to episode 700 of Salsidoparanormal. I'm your host, James Salsido, and tonight I am here with a friend of the show, continuing our conversation about mimics and all the different ways that those can exist. So I'm going to skip the usual introduction just so we can have more of the conversation. Whenever you're ready, Jen, you're welcome to join me again, and thank you for being here again.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
So, yeah, this is we've already covered a lot in the first half of this two-part special, I guess you could call it. And we were just talking about sort of the different ways that, or the different types of examples of this that there are. And I hadn't thought about um, the cryptid angles of it or the Men in Black angles of it, but it really can apply to a lot of things, and that's amazing that that you made all those connections because I had not. So this is a great topic.
It is. I was thinking even about when we're trying to figure out exactly how to pinpoint it. So you have, how would you'd have to figure out that the space is not the only thing generating it. It'd have to be an intelligent entity unto itself. I mean, not necessarily, you could classify either the mimicking as like an activity that is occurring, but if you were to separate it from a location or it being some kind of resonance with a haunted location or a space-time sort of scenario, there's other type of scenario. So you have it in that location, in that kind of situation. But on another level, which that in itself could be that a location becomes intelligent. There's a possibility of that because that would insinuate that the location has become intelligent in some way, or that it is picking up or it's receiving all the information. But on the other hand, you have the idea that there are some type of an intelligent, free-moving entity that is moving around as a type of unknown species or some type of unknown entity that is also capable of this, that is not a bird or something of the kind, that has some type of intention working with, and that it can imitate or mimic what it sees, hears, and it can present itself that way, which is a whole nother level. So if we're trying to pinpoint that down, the imitating what it sees and somehow pushing itself to resemble that, I think trying to narrow down to what are we really talking about with a mimic. In the case of Skinwalker or Wendigo or that sort of concept, they are a mimic not only through sound, but visually as well, in a way. In a Skinwalker, the concept is that it's not quite right. As you said, like it looks like a lot of different people have reported the Skinwalker looking like multiple different creatures kind of blended into one, sort of a conglomeration of all of the entities that it sees. And what's weird about that, though, is you have the idea of, do you have that as a first or a second? Like, is that entity a something that comes after these creatures? But you have the bigger concept of sort of a godlike creature that is all of those creatures, like in Hinduism. And the other creatures, they are a conglomerate. For example, a great daemon of like a forest would appear to be all these different types of creatures and be able to, because it made all of those creatures. Like in the classic idea of angels, the concept being that those angels over different, or those are, say, in the Fae lore and things like that those entities that proceeded over all these different types of creatures, that they'd be a conglomeration of them, and they would be the sound and the making of all of them. And then the individual creatures would be an offshoot from that angelic spirit, so to speak. But when you come in contact with it, this, say, a Lord of the Wild type of concept, or that sort of concept with the case of, I mean, that's not the traditional concept of a Wendigo or a Skinwalker whatsoever, but to conceive of the idea that you could have a starter sort of entity that is a conglomeration of all of those entities, so they could mimic or imitate any of them if they wanted to, because they created them. So that kind of, do you see how that, to me, that's very odd too. So which is it? Is it a following kind of a trespass spirit? A spirit that is introduced into an environment and begins to imitate? Or is it the other way around? And it is the progenitor of all of those species, and so it is capable of imitating any of them. And sometimes people come in contact with them, and as it turns out, it may be a type of predatorial entity, unbeknownst to anyone, but that's exactly how the wild would be. So the wild, being a sort of the way that it is, where it is a survival of the fittest scenario, perhaps the mimic and the concept of in the wild, it could be the other way around even. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, there was a one of the true stories that I found and shared on a show a while ago. It was someone that had moved into a new house in a new neighborhood, and they were the only people living in this area because their house was like the first one that had been finished, I think, in this neighborhood, and it was right on the edge of a forest area, a forested area, and they got this feeling that they were being watched from the somewhere off in the woods, and at first it was like a imposing kind of why are you here kind of feeling, and for a long time they just had feelings. They just had the sense of being watched, but they sort of went about it in a way of they didn't disrespect whoever was out there, whatever was out there. They just sort of put out the intention that this was their new home, and they meant no harm. And eventually that feeling, that negative, close to a negative feeling, but I'm not sure that they really said it was a negative feeling, kind of went away. But they had a sighting before it all kind of stopped, as far as what I could tell, where it was a figure. There was a human-shaped figure, but they were covered in like animal skin, kind of that kind of thing, different animal skins, I believe it was, and like leaves, and they had like a skull. I think the person said they had like an animal skull on their head, like they were wearing it like a mask. And it just sort of stepped out of the woods and faced this person, the person that was writing this account, and then just walked away. And the person's dogs noticed it too, and so they know it wasn't just their imagination, even though they already had feelings. So but still. So I wonder with that, is that an example of what you're talking about there, where especially in cases of and I've heard similar cases before where people move into an area for the first time, as far as I know, and then they have encounters with other beings that were there first,
Right.
and there's always, it can go well, it can go not well. Just depends on the situation and the people involved. But that's what that made me think of. There was that account that I found and shared on a show. I don't even know what it was now. That's the problem with all these shows; they all blend together. But that sounds almost like what you're talking about there.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think so with the case of the Wendigo or the Skinwalker, it's a type of witch, and it can imitate any of those creatures because it has consumed them in the past or something like that. It reminds me of when I was studying voodoo. And to make a voodoo priest or priestess, and it's a really interesting process. There's not a whole lot of them that are officiated, and there's a price on it. It's literally like so many thousands of dollars when you really look into it. I mean, I haven't looked into it, but I have heard of people. I have looked into it, not for myself, but just looking into it out of interest. And as it turns out, the cost is actually to import so many different creatures and animals. So they'd bring in every type of animal you can think of. And then they would sacrifice that animal, and the blood would run over the individual, and then they would be officiated as this priest or priestess, technically, after something like 600 sacrifices, or how many different sacrifices of different animals. Because then they would have almost the life force of that animal or that whatever type of creature. You know, it could be
Right.
turtles and so on and so forth, and all these different things. And these types of shamans or priests basically would then be able to embody any of it. So that's sort of the same thing with the skinwalker, or but the Wendigo is a little different, I think. The Wendigo is like this craven spirit that goes around. It's a cannibalistic spirit, and whatever it eats, it can imitate. So it's very similar in concept, but their hunger grows greater. It starts out as this starved thing, and then as it eats, it becomes bigger and bigger, and its hunger grows like a stomach growing bigger. It takes more to fill it, and so it goes around like that. And so its hunger eventually is so massive that that's the concept of the Wendigo versus the Skinwalker being a type of shaman witch, versus the Wendigo, which is this sort of hungry ghost concept that grows ever hunger the more it eats.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing how many of these things have made their way into popular culture too. I mean, first time I ever heard of a Wendigo was through Marvel Comics, through the X-Men, through actually Wolverine and the Hulk. Their whole for anyone that knows the comics at all, the first major appearance of Wolverine was in Hulk, and it was sort of a people think of just Wolverine and Hulk, and that was the whole story. But from what I've read, it was actually they were dealing with or encountering the Wendigo or a Wendigo creature, and that was part of that original story. And but even just the idea of taking on the characteristics of animals, there's I've seen in different video games now where character classes. There's a character class called they call it a druid, which I have no idea how close that is to the actual druids. But in the games, these druids can actually change into the different animals for their attacks and whatever. And it's a video game, but it's amazing how even when they're changed or exaggerated or whatever, these things have made it into popular culture.
Right. Like the concept of the movie The Mimic, I can't remember what year it was made. It was an old movie, and I haven't looked at it or anything in a long time. So my memory of it is kind of, it's fuzzy. But the idea was that they had some kind of sickness. I don't remember where or how it was all playing out. But scientists had this sickness was being carried by cockroaches. And so they engineered this species of cockroach to mimic and imitate the other cockroaches. And it was sort of like a drone cockroach species that would go into the other existing and imitate and mimic it perfectly. And then should overcome it and try to eradicate this problem, this infestation, because it would have an insatiable hunger. So it kind of ties into the same idea. But of course, it goes wrong. And so it begins to mimic human beings, and it turns into this all masterclass type of, boss figure that is going around. And that was the concept of that film. Do you remember that film?
No, I never actually saw that one. I think I've heard the title before, but never actually saw it. But
it's interesting. But I mean, just even the concept of the imitation of people in general, or the concern we're having about even if there was something that would imitate any other type of creature. But in this case, what we're talking about, I think that people's primary fear and concern is the idea that, even the concept, for some reason, it's it does elicit a type of primal fear. That's something that it's like that the stranger you know, like the idea that something that you know and familiar with, a person you are very familiar with, for example, if they were imitated by somebody else, could you tell the difference? And I think that that is where a lot of that fear would come from, and they
Yeah.
could, yeah,
So, what do you think is more frightening? Someone seeing a mimic of someone else, or seeing a mimic of themselves?
of themselves. If I was,
Yeah,
yeah,
because I've heard accounts of that as well, and sometimes it's really weird because sometimes their double reacts in a totally negative way, like yes, I know, and I'm doing this to basically make you feel bad or make you feel frightened or whatever. Other times it seems like these duplicates don't even realize what's going on and they're just there, or they're just going about normal life and they don't do anything weird, but they're still the exact duplicate of a person that's seeing them. And so I really wonder, what is going on with those situations?
well, it makes me think of the whole concept of the clone conspiracy, which is
Mm,
always that's floating around. So the idea that this is the conspiracy. And bear with me because I'm not super familiar with it, but this is the idea that popular people in music are creating clones. They invest essentially in creating a clone of themselves, so they don't have to perform at these different events. Their clone does it. They don't go on stage. They don't risk the original. They send out a clone. This could be politicians, musicians, so on and so forth. And they send out a clone that is a mimic of themselves. And that is the person, that is what the entity that people are seeing and praising. It's a mimic of the original. And that's the whole conspiracy that I'm gathering with the clone industry of music and things like that. And it's very evolved like conspiracy that is incredible. But so going into the mimicry thing, you could go in even into the cloning and all of that. But once again, we're trying to flesh out, what is the essential nature of, are we focused, is it cloning? Is there another aspect? Is it all the same thing? So it's just the idea that is a whole concept to itself, that you have the mimicking of any type of, locations mimicking what it hears and sees, entities that have different intentions for what they're going to do. But or you have the idea of a folklore demon, basically, that is, yes, a mimic of all the things it is made up of, but is the progenitor of everything that comes after that. So there's like the idea of an all-encompassing demon that may have been the source of all these other types of individual characteristics that make up multiple different types of creatures and entities. And that some people may come across that in these greater folklore tales, the concept of meeting sort of the Lord of the Forest and so on and so forth. That the Lord of the Forest would look like a conglomeration of all of those things because it's the progenitor of them all. But the other hand is that there is something that's only imitating and is not the progenitor. So there's so many different angles with it that it's a lot to keep up with, you know?
yeah, definitely. I've found a few different stories over the years of people who they've had they've known people that they've seen in one place and then seen in another, and they talk to them about how I saw you the other day at this place, and it turns out no, they didn't see that person there. That person was not anywhere near that area. They were either at home or they have witnesses for not being in that area, and that's another amazing angle, because then it's even creepier almost, because then people are talking to these copies without even knowing it in some cases. And
Right.
yeah, it's those are all the different stories that I've heard and read are what sort of led me to realizing how big this is, just as we've been talking about all night here.
It is. It really is, because in that idea, they have the idea that, or maybe it's the idea that you have the possibility that there are truly other versions of yourself because of other dimensions and so on and so forth. They're not imitations. They are literally, but are they or are they not, you know? But I mean, just the whole
Right.
concept. Is it that I think trying to really, we didn't really plan for this, but like the way to really flesh out what specific type of mimic are we trying to discuss? And there's so many different ways to think of it. And so I think just the primal fear of that you could be your original self, but that something could perfectly imitate it. Something could perfectly be, but not, well, maybe not perfectly, but enough to convince others that it was yourself. And the constant thing in popular media that's going on is the idea that there is some type of intelligent entity that only can mimic. So if it only can mimic or imitate and can't have an original, it has no original start. It is only a mirror of what it hears and sees, and it uses that intelligently. It's kind of the AI concept, which is interesting because I think that Python and many of the other things too, they work off of mimic. So, I mean, all of that is really bizarre in our modern world and in general in all the ancient folklores and things like that. The concept that some type of intelligence is only able to mimic, and it has, without any type of mimic, it actually is nothing. And it can only imitate, and that's what makes it what it is. And the fear is what it mimics. But I think the most fear comes from what does it want? What is its initial interest in mimicking? What is the purpose for it? And usually the idea is that it's to interest its prey, to be the concept. Or it could just be that that's what it's able to do. And so I think it would be the intention, wouldn't it, of whatever the initial entity, why it is imitating and mimicking, and when. So you'd have to narrow it down that way, I think.
Yeah, and we're just about done here, but I just wanted to bring up the other amazing thing about that is I have heard accounts of people who see a doppelganger or a double of themselves or someone they know, and it's like the that double is trying to not be seen. And so then you have to wonder, is it because they're not ready, or is it because they know they look like someone else and they don't, they're sort of the maybe the rare cases or the other cases where they don't mean to frighten anyone, but just by their very nature they end up doing that. But that's a whole other thing. That I think it's fine that we're covering all these angles because there are so many angles. I think to just cover one, it might not take a whole show anyway. So this has been great. Thank you for being on here with me, Jen, and again, and I look forward to doing more of these shows from now on whenever we're able to. So thank you
Me
again.
too. Thank you so much, James, and have a good night.
You as well. So that will take care of this episode for tonight. Thank you all again for listening, and I will talk to you all next time on Salsidoparanormal. Have a good night.